Good evening everyone and welcome to another Beyond Zero Emissions monthly discussion group. First we'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the land of the Kulin Nations and pay our respects to their elders past and present. We'd also like to thank the University of Melbourne Energy Research Institute, our Zero Carbon Australia project partners, for this great venue. For those of you that haven't been to one of our discussion groups before, BZE is a climate solutions think tank and research organisation. Our goal is to transform Australia from a 19th century fossil fuel-based economy to a 21st century renewable powered clean tech economy. Our projects include Zero Carbon Australia research, Repower Australia talks, media work, education programs and much more. We're always looking for volunteers to come and talk to us afterwards if you'd like to get involved. This discussion group is a forum for climate change solutions with presentations by experts in their field and is held on the first Monday of every month. Beyond Zero Emissions is leading the way in developing a detailed, costed blueprint for the transition to a completely zero carbon Australia economy, with publications on stationary energy, buildings, high-speed rail, and most recently, land use. Now that we have all this research, the next step is communicating the plans and making them a reality. Tonight's discussion topic is implementing BZE plans at emergency speed. We're excited to welcome Philip Sutton, co-author of Climate Code Red, who will lead the discussion. He's joined by Luke Taylor, Director of the Sustainable Living Festival, and Adrian Whitehead, who's co-founder of Save the Planet, a new political party, and of BZE. We may be joined by some people via Hangouts, perhaps. Thank you, Philip.
Okay, so
Thanks a lot. Well, thanks for having us. To start off with, it's great to be here. And as was mentioned, Philip's, my understanding is that Philip has posed this question in relation to the BZE plans and the potential, I guess, for them. We're exploring how to promote the rapid adoption and implementation of the full suite of BZE reports as a package of measures. So that's the premise of the discussions today. And we've chosen rather than a presentation style, we thought we'd use a bit more of an interview and discussion format. So just sort of sit back and pretend that you're watching I don't know, one of the interview programs. What's the one with the guy? More. I was thinking more of the comedy show on the Graham Norton show. Something like that. Maybe a little bit more serious touch to it. But as mentioned, my name is Luke Taylor. I'm the director of the Sustainable Living Foundation, and most of you would know Philip Sutton. Philip, would you like to just give a little bit of a short introduction to yourself?
Yes, as you know, I've wrote Climate Code Red with scratch. But also since then I've been working on how to try and translate those goals and aspirations of restoring a safe climate to turn it into campaign methods and backing up with the science that's needed, etc.
And we also have Adrian Whitehead here. Adrian, would you like to give a short introduction?
Yeah, so I've got a background as an environmental activist. So my early days were focused on forest campaigns, so campaigned in East Gippsland, South East Forest in New South Wales, and ultimately founded and helped run the Hot Waste campaign that got the Greater Whitehead National Park. 2003 kicked on to climate change, and with Matt, working with Matt, and then we set up and eventually set up Beyond Zero Emissions, and moved on to Save the Planet, which is my main project.
Thank you. So, before we start, just a bit of a show of hands to get a feel for who's in the room. Who here would consider themselves to be a new member to BZE? Sort of, I guess, within the last maybe 2 years, a year to 2 years, some people that have joined. And would you say that then the rest of you would be, hands up for those who consider themselves more as old-time BZEs? Yep. Okay, there's the majority of people here seem to be sort of the older BZE member crew.
Any industry spies? Well,
you should ask. So back to the provocation of the discussion today, which is is really about exploring this, the concept of how we could develop, or how BZE could develop a package, or the package, the suite of reports to be able to help promote this rapid adoption and implementation of the full scale beyond zero emission future that we want to see. So this is a bit of a, I guess, some grounding for us to start off with. I think that one of the things for me looking at BZE has always been that it's one of those groups, and a very rare, and it's a very unique group in the sense that from the very beginning, and Adrian, maybe you'd be best to answer this, considering you were the founder of Beyond Zero Emissions, or one of the co-founder, I should say, of Beyond Zero Emissions, is that it was one of the first groups really that started to call for an emergency response, or work from the base of an emergency response, or what we can call now an emergency response. And there's two things there that I think that are really interesting. One is that Beyond Zero Emissions, obviously in its name, is beyond zero emissions. So you weren't just talking about the concept of zero emissions, you're actually talking about going beyond zero emissions.
Yeah.
And the other thing was the timing aspect, that you started off with the approach and the orientation of working within a 10-year time frame. Can you just to ground us a bit on the kind of the fundamentals of the organisation? Can you just comment, why was it important, why did you say it was important to have those two elements?
Well, we picked that up. I mean, we picked that up right from the start, and I suppose it just got down to, I think strategically and thinking, sort of systems theory is my basic way of thinking. So when we first looked at, we came to climate change via being pro-wind farm campaigners, and that led us to looking at, looking at renewable energy, you're looking at blah, 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 and the links all sort of fall out very quickly. And it was just obvious that you can see from the impacts that had already occurred, like it was the 97 cold bleaching event, and the 2003 floods in Europe, and you just know more and more and more, that if these things are already occurring, then the world was shifting. Like the stable climate that we had is obviously already shifting on a pretty grand scale. So, and if we were doing that now, and knowing the projections that we had for emission levels and the way the world was heading, it just was sort of so obvious that that's what we did. And so the very first, and I remember getting a bit worried at some point, back in about 2007-8 or something, and I rechecked the very first PowerPoints that we ran in 2003, and it said zero emissions now, so it was all catchphrase back then. And we weren't saying negative emissions back then, because at the time we mistakenly thought that the Earth's natural uptake of greenhouse gases would be maintained, and you could sort of work with that to get the drawdown you needed to re-establish a safe climate. That became quite clear that it wasn't happening. And then Philip sort of added that sort of 10-year focus, I suppose, with the climate emergency stuff. But it just was really obvious that it had to be negative emissions, and that's what we meant by zero emissions when we said that at the start as negative emissions, and really fast, because the world was already changing and it was going to change a lot more.
So, Philip, just on this 10-year thing, I mean, you've kind of been fixated on it for quite some time. What's the basis? Why are we using 10 years? I mean, why isn't it 7 years? Why isn't it 8 years? Why are you saying
7 or 8 years would be better? 5 years would be even better. It was a number plucked out of wherever. But the idea was that it was, there were a couple of sources. Lester Brown, who has been a writer on sustainability issues for some time, had actually floated the idea of a decade of transformation, physical change in the economy. So in some respects we're just picking it up from that. But the basic idea was that it was a really short period of time that was long enough that you felt it might be possible to rebuild an economy in that time, because we know from wartime experience, 1939 to 1945, they completely repurposed their economy, and they had enormous changes in output. So it seemed like a realistic time frame, as in doable. But it was the closest we could get to sort of like an emergency response. Now, as we fluff away the time by sort of, just wasting, as society wastes time, in the end it might turn out we have to move faster than 10 years. Who knows? But it's kind of like it's a sufficient kind of wake-up call that once we actually get on the momentum of saying, okay, let society do this, actually really do it. If we have to refine the number, then I'd be quite happy to shorten it if we can manage to accomplish that.
All right, so let's go to the basis of what within the provocation of this discussion, and it's what you put forward. You've actually given me a question here to ask you. Why is it vital to fully implement a BZE solution package in full at emergency speed?
Yeah.
So,
answer. No.
No, it was your question.
Okay. Hopefully I can answer it. What tends to happen is we often treat what we do as an ambit claim, as sort of like it's a radical position. We're going to go for 10 years. We're going to go for the zero emissions. We're going to take CO2 out of the air, and people often then think, oh, that's just to kind of demonstrate that you could do something pretty strong, big, audacious, hairy goals or whatever. But in fact, if you actually look at the time we've got, at one of the previous BZE meetings, David Corolli, climate scientist who we all know pretty well, I think, was asked, I think it was by, Mike Stainville, I think, actually asked the question. He said, David Spratt had been quoting a graph, which is actually this one here, which you can't see, but anyway, it's was prepared by Mike Brownpack and a couple of other climate scientists. They're Australian, working in Australia. And what they did is whereas we normally just, the scientists will talk about a number, what temperature do we want or whatever. People tend not to talk about what's the probability of actually having a decent outcome. Now, what's really interesting is if you said, okay, well, if we wanted to have certain level of success in achieving, let's say, 2 degrees. Now, this blue curve here that you probably can't see, that's the 2-degree curve. And if you then say, well, the IPCC, the International Climate Panel, they previously, up until very recently, have always talked about having a 50-50 chance of succeeding with whatever they're talking about. Now, that might make sense as a scientific experiment. What's the midpoint between it going that way and that way? But if we're living on the planet and we're talking about what's happening to us, having a 50-50 chance of success is pretty ridiculous, obviously. And so what this graph was enabling people to do is to say how much of a carbon budget we actually have left if we want to have certain degrees of success. So, for example, I asked a friend of mine, Jack Schmidt, who works as a safety engineer, and I said, what level of safety would stock standard, you have in industry as the minimum failure rate? And he said, top of his head, he said, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000. Now, if you're doing civil aviation, like if you're talking about aircraft or something, or, hard disks in your computer, or, mission critical something else's, you might be up in the 1 in a million failure rate, or even much better than that. Now, okay, let's see if we can find a point on this curve which corresponds to 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 10,000. Well, it's actually very hard to find on the curve because it's down here somewhere. But let's take something that's in fact a really poor safety standard, a 1 in 10 chance of failure. And for 2 degrees, 2 degrees, by the way, is hot enough to mobilise all the carbon in the permafrost land areas in the Arctic area, which will release something like 6 times the total amount of CO2 that's ever been released by humans. Mind you, it might take 300 years to go up, but 2 degrees is enough to do that. In fact, 1.5 degrees is. So, how much budget have we got left if we want to have a 1 in 10 failure rate for a 2-degree target, which is too high? You look at the curve and it's there. That's the point for a 90% success rate, or a 1 in 10 failure rate. And you come across here and say, what's your carbon budget? And it turns out that the amount that we've already put out is the same as what you'd be allowed to have with a 1 in 10 failure rate, i.e. there is no carbon budget left. Right? And that's with a safety margin which is actually very poor. So if you were going to go for a 1 in 10,000 safety margin, which is what you should be doing if you're building bridges, roads, houses, buildings, anything, hospital equipment, can't be even higher. If you're going to go for that, well, we ran out of the budget quite some time ago. The budget I just mentioned was exceeded in 2012. That's the 1 in 10 failure rate budget. So if there is no budget, how fast do we need to move? And how big does our response need to be? Well, the answer is if there's no carbon budget, then that means that there is no acceptable emissions at all. So therefore the whole notion of a zero emissions target is completely appropriate. In other words, the zero emissions part of it is completely appropriate and it should be done now. And we've already exceeded the budget, which means we've actually got drawdown we have to meet even to have a 1 in 10 chance have no more than a 1 in 10 chance of failing at 2 degrees, which is too hot. So clearly the drawdown requirement's even bigger. So when you look at the BZE plans, these are not radical things at all. These, if anything, are a little bit on the conservative side, but it's basically what we have to do, all of it.
So Adrian, just bringing you in, we'll come back to BZE in just a moment, but I'm just interested.
So I'm still working on trying to save the planet while we're in the meeting, sorry. We've run out of time.
So I'm just interested now, given obviously you agree with what Philip's just said in terms of, I guess, the state of play. What does it mean for you? We've moved on now from beyond zero emissions and moved into the more direct political sphere. What has it meant for you, that context? What does it mean for the establishment of Safe Planet?
I suppose I'll take it back to slightly broaden out the issue. So, it was quite amazing. Me and Matt have been working away on the message for a long time, and we saw that impact that Climate Code Red had, where we've been talking to people about the same sort of stuff that was in the Climate Code Red Book, and getting the sort of acknowledgement, but no one firing up too much. So it was people would fire up, it just wasn't getting the bite. And then suddenly when Philip and David put together their PDF, it was amazing that power of that physical symbol. People literally had a club that they could beat people with, and they went out sort of...
and the Climate Code Red
PDF, the original PDF. And so then Beyond Zero Emissions started that focus around getting the solutions going, and that was all good. And me and Matt had worked on mainly Matt, because he's got that sort of genius technical idea side of things. Started working on the scopes for like a renewable-based power grid, and then that grew into the stationary energy report at some later point. But what stuns me, I suppose, is that something that I see literally as obvious as the sun coming up in the morning, sort of thing, like a bright blinding light, still hasn't actually got resonance in the broader environment movement. And it's deeply concerning to me and incredibly saddening to me actually at the same time. And there seems to be, despite the work that BZE have done, we've done in different spots, this reticence to actually face how serious the situation is, be honest about it, and actually talk about the solutions that need to be implemented. And you can see that across the board. We can see it in the messaging around most of the scorecards that were produced in this election. They'll talk about, they'll talk about something like, I'll have a glance at one at the moment. They'll talk about renewable energy. Does this person want to go to 100% renewable energy? Yes. Will they stop the east-west link? Yes, no. Pose new coal and gas and climate crisis leaders and strong action. And that's sort of all right, but it's just really missing that major framing about really making that a solid element of that communication. Like, what have we got to do? Are they doing that? And really, no one really is at the moment. So, yeah. That's what's led me to do this, just to try and take a leadership position and eventually create, the basic thing with any communication is if you don't say what you want, you're never going to get it. So it's just starting that process of saying what you want.
To look back to this concept of BZE creating the full package, as you put it, selling the full package. Okay, so is what you're talking about here, is it a marketing issue, or are you saying that what's really needed is further research to be able to have, if you like, a kind of another layer of the onion skin around the single reports that BZE currently has? Is there more research, I guess, needed to be able to get to a point where you can say, okay, we have a full package and now we can go and sell it? Or are you really just talking about, is this a marketing question that we're saying?
When I first thought about it, I think maybe there's actually a bit of both. Both sort of some further work, but also the marketing. But when I first started out, I've just got 2 of the reports here, and so you put on the high-speed rail and the buildings plan and the land use plan. So you got this encyclopedia building up, and when any conventional campaigner goes through these reports and has a look at them, when they read the recommendations, what they're seeing is every line is a campaign. There's all these power stations to shut down, there's all this new stuff to build, there's all the retrofitting to be done in the buildings, there's the transport system to change, and there's, you just go through every sector of the economy. And the way we're used to doing it, what do? We go, for close down Hazelwood, and we go for, protect the wreck. And so all these little, sort of not necessarily all little, but they're pieces of action. But when you've got the whole encyclopedia of BZE reports, the amount of campaigning work that you have to do to drive that through to success, to fruition, single issue campaign by single issue campaign, if that's all we did. I'm not saying we shouldn't do single issue campaigning, by the way, but if that's the only thing we did, if you kind of figured out that some campaigns, the most likely, the fastest ones to succeed rarely succeed under, let's say, 4, 5, 6 years. Many campaigns will run for 10, 20, I don't know, whatever. Like you could have 1,000 years, you could have 2,000 years worth of campaigning just in the BZE plans.
So the Otway Forest campaign, for instance, was conceptualised at a tram stop just outside of Melbourne Union's Med School, and then was implemented in 1993, and then it was won with a government decision in 2002, and then implemented in the real in 2008. So that's just one small flash.
So that's over 10 years. Yeah. So the thing is that when you think about it, we're not going to get this whole package implemented if all we do is just pick out the eyes of it and then campaign individually for those particular things and then hope it'll come through. So the thing is, we're all trained up like for the last 30, 40 years. Well, in fact, there's almost really no history in the environment movement for campaigning for the whole thing. The closest we got to it was probably back in the sort of 80s or something, when the conservative society idea was kind of getting a lot of traction. And so people were sort of thinking, maybe we need to make a system change. But they weren't thinking about the details. This is a very kind of hands-on thing. You can actually see exactly what needs to be done. So that sort of begged the question to my mind, well, what would be an equivalent situation where societies had to deal with this really massive change on a huge scale, with huge speed, and changing the economy enormously. And that's where the World War II analogy kind of came in.
But isn't this a campaigning conversation? I mean, couldn't you say that Beyond Zero Emissions is a research organisation? It's invested its resources in producing a set of, there's an encyclopedia full of reports. It's done a really good job on that, and it's continuing to do that. Isn't the question that you're bringing up really about how do we go out and we campaign with the encyclopedia?
Yeah, well, I think that's the starting point. In other words, it strikes me as a whole new idea. I mean, even though BZE has called these part of the suite, I think at the moment most people, people promoted the stationary energy report content, and then it became Repower South Australia, Port Augusta, and you could see it becoming translated into the single issue campaign. So I agree that part of what's being raised by this question is there any other way that we can campaign? So that is a campaigning question. But the thing is, once you actually if you decide to go down that route of campaigning in a new way, then you'd find that you probably need additional support resources. So, for example, when I started looking at that kind of thing, and these books that I've got here on the chair, a collection of things I collected on World War II. It was really funny. This book here, which I got on Amazon, which was written in about 1946 or something, so it's like, the year after the Second World War finished. The Americans set up a history department during the Second World War because they hadn't properly documented what they did in the First World War, and they sort of felt like they were kind of muddling around and having to reinvent the wheel all the time. So they set up this history unit to work out how you do world wars and but how you manage the economy. So this book is how they managed the economy in America, during that time. Now, in some respects, it's not an exact parallel, but it's certainly highly informative. Now, I think that if as campaigners we want to get out there and start promoting the BZE package, it would be great in the first instance if as many people as possible actually kind of read some of this stuff. There's a shorter one. This is written by a right-wing think tank group, and a guy who used to work for that background. But it's showing, how the war was won by American private enterprise, how they geared up, and then there's a fantastic series that's been done by a guy called Paul Queston, and he's looking at what happened during the Second World War itself, but also what happened in the period between the First and the Second World War. And this one's amazing. The one between the wars is amazing because it's actually describing the equivalent of the period we're now in. It was a period when the war wasn't yet happening. It was a period when people they sort of felt like it was coming, but they didn't want to face it, and they didn't know what to do, and they weren't sure, and they were muddling around, and it felt terribly indecisive. And there was this huge majority against taking action. Because, who the hell wanted to go through another world war? They had pretty good reasons for having that point of view. But this material is kind of very inspiring individually to read. One of the ones that got me going sort of early in the piece was this is about how the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb project, was organised. And you suddenly find that it's really interesting. The guy put in charge of it was a project manager. He built the Pentagon building. He's an engineer. And his job was to create and deliver technology, atom bombs. I should say, by the way, I'm not a warmonger. I don't actually think that creating world wars is a good idea. The really nice thing about the work we're doing is that rather than trying to work out how to kill 55 million people, which is how many roughly do die in the Second World War, our job is to actually avoid causing the death of perhaps a couple of billion. So we've got quite a different job that we're working on, and yet the experience of that Second World War in terms of people fearful for their lives, similar situation, they realised they had to mobilise on a huge scale and at great speed, similar. They had to change the economy. It wasn't just a matter of changing laws, it was actually physically they had to do something very different. That's the same as what we've got. So these things are great sort of initially as inspiration, but then we also need to find, I don't know. How many people will read this stuff? The answer is not many. So therefore, we've got to find ways of getting some of the essence of that across.
That's essentially what you're describing is another plank of the BZE report requirements, which is, now we've got a list of how to do the economy and that sort of slated. And there's also industrial processes as well. So.
Yeah.
And so, was that originally part of the idea in the beginning, that would be a part of the encyclopedia would be in a sense to how to guide? I mean, here are all the things that you will do to the economy, but here's actually how you implement.
So when me and Matt, by the time I left, we were just working on the stationary energy side of it, but then taking it right back to the very first type of campaigning we did, was every time we spoke, we would mention stationary energy, transport, agriculture and forestry, and sort of draw down stuff as well. And so that was the difference between, even today, mainstream environment groups don't focus on the whole spectrum. They'll be talking about a campaign around shoving coal, renewables or something, leave out agriculture or transport or whatever. And each is obviously as important as each other. We don't make it through unless we actually implement the package. So that was just embedded in the philosophy from the start. So
Philip, you've kind of given a bit of a sense by showing us the books about, you're saying that there is this, in a sense, this this other piece of research work in terms of the implementation that could be done, separate from the marketing and the campaigning. I think separating those two out is sort of worthwhile. Just back on the research aspect, can you be a little bit more specific? Like, what are the segments of work that you actually need to work through in that piece of work, in the implementation report or whatever?
Yeah, I think there's two parts of the implementation. There's two kind of very different things which kind of reflect the questions that we raised with this session today, which is let's say we just wave the magic wand and today or tomorrow, wake up tomorrow morning and society has decided we'll do this, we'll commit to this thing and it's going to happen, and it does. So how would you manage, how would you actually run the economy? What does Daniel Andrews and Tony Abbott, whatever, anyway, how are they going to actually drive this thing through, or how do we do it as a society? And at the moment, for example, we've had, 20 years where we've been kind of ground into accepting kind of a neoliberal economic method. And so the question is, can that deliver it? Now, when you look at the history of the Second World War, no way. I mean, you can't achieve the scale of change and speed of change using those methodologies, kind of a laissez-faire approach. But then the thing is, the other thing you learn from the Second World War is how did they manage to do so much so quickly? It's because they had a fairly high level of unanimity, that they knew what their problem was. Each side knew that they had to defeat the other side. Pretty crude, but it drew a lot of people together. And that meant that people could work across political boundaries. And so what happened was, before the war was declared, industry fought tooth and nail against all forms of regulation. And in fact even the military did that as well. They were used to not getting their way in the period between First and Second World War. Once the war was declared, they just suddenly said, okay, we've just got to turn the entire economy over to this goal and bugger anybody else and what they want. And they wanted to close down the whole industry, so automobile production was stopped straight away. And, like half the total economic activity, which had previously been directed towards consumer products, was turned over to the war economy. So that was in the space of 12 months. So the thing is, how did that happen? I mean, these are things we need to learn so we can actually start talking about it in the present context. If we go about our campaign saying, well, we're going to do this in the context of a neoliberal framework, can that work? Well, from the experience of the Second World War, the answer is no, it can't. But we then usually form what I think is a false conclusion, which is people say, well, if neoliberalism won't work, then obviously we're going to be in some kind of very highly interventionist left-wing thing, and it's, the people workers' revolution is going to take over, and this is what's going to drive it. But the only reason why the Second World War stuff could work is because people said, we don't care what the system was. Like in Russia it was communism, in America it was capitalism, in Germany it was some kind of fascist capitalist thing or whatever. Every society, Britain, they all said, okay, basically, we're not going to have the revolution and get rid of our system as it is now. We just, for the duration, will agree to do things differently until we solve the problem, and then we'll go back to our normal system. So Russia went back to communism, Britain went back to, sort of this time somewhat more, sort of welfare statist capitalism. America went back to doing their stuff, and so on. So that's a really important lesson to learn. If you want to create a super majority of strong support, in a very short time, when people are not going to rethink their basic beliefs in a hurry, and there's no time for anybody's revolution, no matter whose it is. The only thing you can really do is get people to agree that we'll solve this problem, and then people will just work out what's the logical consequence of solving the problem, and then we do what is needed. And in the end, of course, it makes big changes, but it's done for the period in which you're restructuring.
And I guess that this sort of creation of this implementation report is sort of the nub of really what you're saying, because it's only then, once you start really working on that report, in a sense, that you start working for the full implementation of the whole package.
That's right.
Whereas at the moment, as you're concerned about the danger of us just taking one little bit of work here and a little bit of work there, and as you said before, we end up 2,000 years of work of single issue campaign.
Yeah.
So if we had this implementation report, what use, Adrian, is it of to campaigns, political and community campaigns? Like how would it actually be used?
Oh, I think the power of all the Beyond Zero Emissions report is just having this solidly argued, intelligently put together reference document that you can act to use to support your arguments, and that's really powerful. And it had a massive impact in the renewable energy. Like, not that long ago, a person, and they'll remain nameless, I'll try and remember not to say his name, or her name, who now runs a fairly major environment group. I remember discussions with me and Matt and him, or her, saying, you know, we can do 100% renewables, and this person would say, no, it's 30%, it's absolutely 30%, that's all we can do. And Matt would turn around and go, you are quoting the coal report written by, Matt has already said, written by this person, and paid for by the coal industry. That's what you're quoting, do you understand that? And the person goes, oh, like that. And this person heads a major environment group now, and this person obviously knows we do 100% renewable, but that's now. And that's now. So we've got this situation where a lot of the concepts are difficult for people to get round until they've got that really solid argument. Like, for me, what was almost intuitively obvious the moment I looked at climate change, what we had to do. For some people, even though they might get it at some level, just the complexity and the difficulty and the of the problem and the solution itself becomes the barrier to them articulating what we need to do. And so, it would be incredibly powerful to have that. And just talking, bringing it back to BZE, like, I applaud all of you for maintaining your commitment to BZE and keep supporting it, and we've got to keep getting those reports out. But don't stop, whatever you do. Even if it takes a couple more years. But and then the other thing is simply, just the power of getting that communication message out. And the thing that I don't quite get is why people don't, maybe someone has some insight in here, but why people, despite having Philip did risk assessments back in 2005 and stuff that showed it's so obvious that where we're going was just really dangerous, and then there's, cancer and stuff, etc. Yet people still talk about, the Christine Mill will get out there and say net zero by 2050, which is weaker than their actual the green stated goal. I just find it very difficult to understand why people are still being pragmatic. Politically pragmatic or personally pragmatic or fearful.
The funny thing is that political pragmatism is not issue pragmatic. Like the problem we've got to face is one which requires this really strong response. That is actually the pragmatic response. Like if you look at the damage that would be done and not succeeding, what would happen? The pragmatic, practical thing is to actually do the whole damn thing.
Yeah, it's the politics that dominate. Did anyone see my meme that I did on Facebook that showed all the policy messaging from 5 major parties and what they had on it? Yeah, one person saying. So basically Labor just says for the people, and Liberals say jobs and something else, and animal justice, there's a few strong statements on animal justice, and the Greens have a comment about renewable energy and lowering the price plus 4 other points, which is more detailed than all the rest before. And so, even today, the party that's meant to be the party that should be leading this is not. And in a sense, we've got to get to the... So, the wind's going to be political. So how do we get there? And we need parties to adopt the suite of stuff that BZE is working on as their goals. And then, not only do we need that, then we need to up them to actually be their lead goal at election. And then we need 50 plus 1% of them to win government and implement it. Like that's sort of going to be it.
Sorry, we might just take questions. Can you hold your questions for a moment? I'll do one last question, then we'll go straight after everybody. But just the final question before we take questions from the audience is I just want to explore this question of how to approach elites. So, I mean, if we were to create this full package implementation report or part of the encyclopedia, so to speak, how would you see it relate to the elites? And I guess it's partly a campaigning question, but it's also, I guess, I'm thinking of what's the best way to put together a report like this?
I think one of the really effective things about the BZE reports is because they are so technically detailed and so well worked out, they actually have a degree of credibility which enables them to be taken into elite settings where people are going to be saying, you know, am I going to go with this line of argument? Am I going to, you know, redirect millions or tens of millions or billions of dollars worth of investment? And should I take it seriously? Now, if you just go in with very flimsy arguments, you know, just based on good feelings, then a lot of those people, they just won't take that risk, you know, for whatever reason. I mean, you might say that they're stupid because their whole survival rests on it, but it's very hard to do. So the basic notion of these kind of very, very well-argued reports gives an entree into elite circles, which is crucial. Now, the question is, okay, you can use it to get entree, but is it actually even worth bothering? I mean, some people put the argument that it's only going to be a grassroots, you know, kind of revolt that's going to make this change happen. But in the time period we have to get action, the people who know how to actually make the economy go in that direction or some other direction are people who are in this elite structure. And I think we make a mistake in thinking that there is just one elite, there's just one mindset. It's just not true. I mean, they fight each other all the time.
There's Scotch and Xavier.
Well, see, in this context, it doesn't really matter whether you're from which private school you went or whether you can go to one at all. But there's the fossil fuel, I mean, there's the people who are driving the problem, and then there's the whole of the rest of the economy. Does anybody have any idea, by the way, just how big, what percentage of money does the fossil fuel industry itself control in the Australian economy? What percentage of the Australian economy's total turnover, which includes the wages of workers, but what percentage of that total do you think? Anybody?
I think it's less than 5%.
So where's the question coming from?
The answers.
Okay, sorry. It's probably somewhere between 5 and 10%.
Right.
Now, we get very fearful of the power of the fossil fuel industry because we think we get a lot of money, but that's because we compare it with our personal bank accounts, right? Any fossil fuel company is going to have a hell of a lot more than I've got, that's for sure. But if you compare them with the rest of the economy, they're only, as you say, 5 to 10% of that economy, and they'll have some rusted-on friends who might bring it up, if you're lucky, to a 30%. But the thing is that 70% of the economy has got 70% of the money, 70% of the power if they get organised. And so really the thing is, we can play a role. We can both work in the grassroots, and we should, and we can work through making connections. You know, we might have ourselves, or we may have friends. We may be able to find our way, network our way into these sort of elite areas. And I know that BZE's work has, you know, like a lot of the big consulting firms, engineering consulting firms that help with BZE reports. Those people are knocking around with top end of town elites all the time. So this organisation already has connections into that sort of sphere. Now, if you then say, okay, the job is to convince 70% of the economy or 80% to go and tell the other 20% that they don't want to go down the future that they're creating anymore, that they won't. Now, remember back in the period with the Whitlam government through to the Hawke government, they got rid of the tariff system in Australia. That was driven by an original bright idea that came out of the minerals industry, I believe. And they needed to get allies, so they then talked to the farmers who were in a similar economic position in terms of input costs and export benefits and so on. And they then said, okay, if we're going to get rid of tariffs, who else can we get on side? So they said, well, we need to get the consumers, because if they can have floods of stuff coming in from overseas, consumer products that are cheap, then that'll be, you know, somebody else will benefit. So they stitched together an alliance that was representative of about, in the end, about 60% of the economy. And that left the Australian manufacturing industry, which at the time was almost the biggest single industry sector by itself. But in alliance, this other group was much bigger. And they crunched an industry that's 25% of the economy. And remember, like, how big is the fossil fuel industry in Australia? Maybe 10%, compared to the manufacturing sector, which lost the battle back in the 70s through the 80s, when they were 25% of the economy. So the crucial thing is to get a big enough coalition. And so we have to be prepared to work both at that elite level, and you need well-developed arguments to carry that, as well as working at the grassroots level.
Yeah, just the most simple thing. I mean, we still, that frame where we can do all of that, when people are still saying when people are not messaging correctly around the climate emergency. And
This
saying
is your big issue.
Yeah, that's my big issue. So people have just got to message properly and frame all the work. So every I'll give you an example. So that if the BZE does a plan around the fast train, it has, when people speak about it, when you go and speak about it, it's not because fast trains are good, because they're great, right? But it's about because fast trains are part of the solution that to stop us all ending up in Mad Max 2. Right? That's why we want the fast trains. And people, because that's slightly uncomfortable to talk about, people will often, and right through the climate movement and the environment movement in general, flip back away from saying the hard things and start and just want to talk about things, the classic environmentalism, like, fast trains are good because they can be run on renewable energy and they're better than flying, and, blah, 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 all sorts of things.
But not linking back to the actual cause.
Yeah, not linking back to the cause. So we're faced with this problem where...
A big part of that, though, is because sections of the environment have found it very difficult to obviously get traction, even with, weaker demands.
Yeah, but
so how do you...
Well, that's a whole... invite me and a couple other people back to talk about how do we campaign properly. And very few people know how to do it. So for instance, question to the audience. ALP's in power, right? What's the point of leverage? Where do you focus? You've got $100,000, you're going to run a marginal C campaign, you want a national park out in the Yarra Ranges. Where do you focus? Is it Labor Liberal marginals or is it Green Labor marginals? Where do you focus for the next 4 years? Who's in Labor Liberal marginals? Who's in Green Labor marginals? Okay, good. Okay, so everyone else doesn't know. So if it was me, it would be Labor Greens marginals, because Labor's got a pretty big majority. They might even hold the election, but the vote will slip back. The Greens vote continues, and unless you want to hurt them really badly, they need to deliver pain. And if you can hand the 4 Labor Green marginal seats over to the Greens, then Labor might actually want to do something like have a national park, right? So it's just a simple thing, okay? So and behind that is complexity beyond, simple but complex. But I'm just saying that that's some logic that, and my friends at the Forest campaigners, and I've been ringing them up for weeks and saying, when are you coming into the, and some of them did, which was great, and they produced maybe in Melbourne, mainly in Melbourne, but what do we do for the next 4 years? Exactly. But anyway, I'm just saying there's some basic lack of understanding. And so the question when I asked Mark at the breakthrough thing, how do you get your leverage once Labor's in power? It's easy to leverage against the Liberals at the moment because Liberals are bad, Labor's good. So you say, don't vote for Liberals, vote for Labor. So what do you do when Labor's in power and Liberals are in opposition? Are Liberals going to be better on the environment and climate change than Labor? At the moment, no. So you don't have any reverse leverage. So it's about leverage. But then all of that is sort of irrelevant as well, because the time that we need to move is much faster than even those campaigns I'm talking about. So that's why I get back to simply, as a minimum, everyone should be talking about the climate emergency, achieving a safe climate, talking about the whole solution package and why we need to do it, and just keep repeating that mantra rather than talking about
We're running out of time too, I think. We need to finish
8
8 o'clock. Okay, well, we want a good half hour to be able to talk to the members. So, Philip, can I put that on hold? I'll come back to your question. Thanks for holding on to us.
Philip, I really like the wartime analogy, and I think the thing about going back to the previous system at the end is probably what helps to sell it. The biggest difference still to me is for the average man in the street or the politician in the street. The wartime was obvious and immediate. It wasn't sometime in the future we're going to do something about that. I mean, they may get to that point where they do feel like it's now, but they certainly don't feel that way at the moment. How do we make that work when, to most people, it's in the future? And the other thing about the war is you didn't have people who denied it was happening.
Yeah.
There is no such thing as a world war going on. No one was saying that.
Yeah.
When
those... Sorry?
Make the heat death rate explicit. 500 extra people died during Black Saturday.
That's
no
right.
Indian flames, just from the heat stress.
Yeah, I understand all of those arguments.
But I think it's a question of picking up what you're both saying.
Yeah.
I think that's, your question and your response, I think, can be put together.
Yeah.
Just as an analogy, in 1600 and whatever, Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, was flattened by a tsunami. if the few people who survived spent the next, I don't know how many years, debating about who caused it and what sins it was that they committed that led to God punishing them and sending the tsunami through Lisbon and destroying it. Okay, fast forward to San Francisco in 1920, whatever it was, I can't remember the dates, I keep on forgetting, 1925-ish. And a big slab of the city gets knocked down by an earthquake. And were people mainly debating how sinful they'd been? I mean, they probably had good reason to debate that, but they didn't. What they did is they were talking about geology and, you know, the movement of the earth and all that sort of stuff. So in other words, the understanding of what was the causative factor had shifted dramatically in that period of time. Go back to the floods in Brisbane, you know, not so many years ago. You know, those massive floods that my understanding is they did something of the order of about $30 billion worth of damage. Now, because that's the coal state, along with New South Wales, whatever, and Victoria, because they're a coal state, the climate work could not be mentioned. So what happens, Anna Bligh goes out there and does a really great job of trying to help people sort of, you know, cope with the disaster. But the notion of actually saying this thing is our Pearl Harbor, this is caused by climate change and this is something we're going to have to act on, and of course it's a global issue, so we're going to have to work with people across the world, plus do our own bit. That notion of taking that up wasn't done because we wished not to hear it. Now that was a bit like the Second World War before the war actually was declared, when people, like American boats were being sunk by the Germans, and the Americans would say, you know, see no evil, hear no evil, you know, whatever. They didn't want to go in the war. They just said, if we just kind of, you know, take it on the chin and sort of whatever, maybe we can stay out of the war. And so on.
The people ignoring even Germany arming up.
Oh, yes, oh, they ignored the army. Oh, absolutely. But I guess what I'm really trying to say, and this comes back to the comment that the person at the back made about the heat stress issue. I think that we've got a lot of work to do to get out to people and say, climate change impacts are happening now. They're actually serious. If these acts of damage were being done by some alien force, if it was Osama bin Laden or somebody, you know, favourite enemy, had done this stuff and killed 178 people in the bushfires here, and what was it, the 500 who died from heat stress, we'd be all out there kind of with machetes knocking people down all over the place in kind of mad frenzy. But we've decided to reframe it as being a natural disaster. So I think what we have to do, the crucial thing is to say, climate change is happening now. It's going to be a hell of a lot worse later. But just don't miss the point that it's pretty bad right now, and it's not something that we'd actually accept now. If we had a choice back 10, 20 years ago, would you like to have 500 people die every time you have a serious, you know...
and that's something Adam Bank did really well with the last set of fires, where he publicly went out and said these fires are climate change.
Yeah.
And that's and at the 2009 fires, the environment movement didn't do that.
Yeah.
So
But he got slammed for that.
but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. He gets slammed, right? So the point is, he will get slammed because people don't want to hear the message. But the point is, there's a whole bunch of people like me who go, "Yay, you know,
we've got to back them when they come out."
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we should also.
You know, they try to do the old, you know, you're using people's tragedy as a political point. Well,
Which is what the lobbyists do every time. They come out and say it's the Greenies' fault because there's a national park somewhere in the state. You know, causing fires. Yeah, they all start in the national park.
Is it worth making an economic statement of how many man-hours, person-hours, whatever, are crippled or cruelled by excess of heat?
Yeah.
Rather than talking about the death rate all the time, we could just say how unproductive the state is if it's excessively hot.
I'd do both. I think the time probably to raise the deaths is a lot in between the disasters. I bring people back to that then. So when they go into a disaster, they don't have to have somebody sitting on the shoulder immediately saying it in a big way, because people are caught up with the tragedy at the time. But I think we need to be able to talk about it in the other periods. I wouldn't underestimate the importance of mentioning the death rates, but I do agree with you that there is this kind of general productivity loss that for some people is important.
Just got a question up here and then I'll come back to you, sir.
I'm all this very blokey, I'm sorry to say. I often toy with the idea of carbon rations. The only place I've really seen this described, you know, is on the wartime analogy of the food rations, but it was in a book called Carbon Diaries, which was for young adults, and she just pictured the scenario of putting everyone on carbon rations and the panic that it created, but it started to make people's thinking real. And I feel that so many people have opted out of this. There's a book written, Don't Even Think About It, like we're hardwired to not think about carbon. I think there's some truth in that. It's very hard society-wide to get that changed. And I wonder if there's not some lever that you can push, like carbon rations. You know, we used to have carbon footprints, and people do carbon footprint calculate, and they go on the overseas holiday and get a little offset and all that. It's too bourgeois. It's not anywhere near what's needed. And I wonder what you think about carbon rations. I've asked this to lots of people and they're always tossed back, nobody likes it. But what do you think about carbon rations?
It's my only problem with carbon rations because it's sort of negative X, so that's the ration. So you
Does
don't.
it make people feel in pain?
Yeah, but maybe you could have a sliding thing and you can say it, but the reality is there is no carbon budget. So the
Ration,
the ration's just negative. It's like each person has to draw down. So like we could divide the drawdown level up, and you've got to be planting so many trees and digging in so much biochar every year or something. But so that's my only problem with it, because once you say there's a carbon ration, unless you're talking about it going from X down to 0 in 5 or 6 years, then you're actually implying that there's something to ration, that there is a thing. And so it was in the very early days that, people like me, Matt and Philip, understood that there was no carbon budget left, and we'd be arguing with people like David Spratley now gets it completely, that we spent, 2 years trying to get into not getting, because there's this concept around social justice around the world that we had all this carbon we could spend, and it had to go to the third world, but the reality is that there is no carbon budget left, in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, probably in fairness to Dave, it's probably more about having the data to show it and then feel confident enough to be able to
So you still need a personal accounting, a personal feedback, a personal trough of how much, even if it requires people to be prosumers in order to have a trough, you still need something that allows the individual to see what their impact is. I was raised in the Engineers Australia conference last week. Why don't we have a carbon accounting on the supermarket sheet?
I think they have it in England.
They do it, well, they've got it in England, that's easier to implement here. If it's already been figured out somewhere else,
Yeah, it's done somewhere
let's
on
implement it here immediately.
Just a quick one. What I've been inclined to do, like if you look at the wartime thing, the way that they probably would have handled it in this case, they use rationing for things where there was something to be rationed. Like you had to give people food, so you couldn't run that down to 0.
It was also to create solidarity and fairness.
Yeah, I understand.
They policed it.
Yeah. But if you had to get something to 0 quickly, see, at the moment what we do is we put a price on it, and we sort of make it painful to use that particular thing. But the thing is, if you haven't built the public transport, and if you haven't done the various other things that are needed to enable you to stop using the energy, then it's difficult and people just have to pay through the nose for the tax. It's probably a lot easier just simply to say, pass a law, like Dan Andrews passes a law in 12 months' time which says there will be no further investment in fossil fuels in Victoria. Full stop. Done. That gives you complete certainty for the energy future, because everybody knows that any augmentation of the system is going to be renewables. So it's completely secure and known. And then people just have to watch, see what the demand is, and then they work on it. Then you say, okay, what about the existing power stations? How much of them do they have to close down? The answer is all of them. And so, over what period of time, say you work out a schedule for that, and then you work out how much compensation is appropriate, and it may not be much because people should have known that they had to make this change some time ago.
They were actually paying not to make the change.
Yeah. So, but anyway, the point is that you could have a conscious decision by the government to say we're going to phase these things out over X period of time, which is a short period of time, hopefully, not more than 10 years. And then you might say, okay, now how do we finesse? How do we make sure that people get enough of what they need, and how do we run things sort of in a sense around those policy decisions? And at that stage, rationing things may be appropriate. I don't know, but it may well be that comes out. But one thing I do think is very true from what you're saying is the notion of fair treatment, that we're all in it together and we're fairly treated, and certain people are not being screwed really badly compared to some other people.
there isn't a black market.
That's right, that's really crucial, and that's why the rationing system was so important during the Second World War, was to make sure that people felt that they were all sharing the pain. And that just because you happen to be, have a very large wallet, it didn't mean that you escaped the pain that other people had to put up with.
Okay, we might move on now. The gentleman in the glasses.
Several people, quite a lot of people say to me when I do my BZE talks that you're not going to get anywhere until the really powerful people start to feel the pinch, start to suffer. And the way around that I think I see as the way to go is one needs to put together some business cases that people leading industries will recognise, so that they can say, you can have this, we had these terrible floods in Brisbane. Okay, you have a flood in Melbourne, a flood in so-and-so, what's it going to do to this, that industries, and actually work it out in dollars and the future of their company, and how many people they're going to be able to employ after they've gone broke because their whole business has collapsed, and start to translate it into terms that they understand like that. Then you might get their attention. If we simply do the greeny thing and talk about, oh, how dreadful, we've got this, all this stuff in the Arctic that's melting, isn't that terrible? It doesn't penetrate your average totally convinced capitalist who can only see as far as his profit line next week.
Just partially with the the complete lack of comprehension of what to do with most people are taught linear maths and we're thinking about the behaviour of non-linear maths and have not a clue as to what they're missing in the way of analogy.
Can I just respond to that? So, when we ran the Always campaign, the thing that we came up with is this idea of what we call total campaign, which was messaging about the Always Forest from every possible angle we could possibly message from. So we did everything from set up the greens down there where there were no greens, so we had a political party talking about it, we talked to local councils, we talked to schools, we talked to hospitals, we talked, you can save money by using this toilet paper versus this toilet paper, we educated the public about trees, we got on the Chamber of Commerce and Tourism, right? So we just did it from every possible angle. So this is the same, right? So everything that you said is valid and totally correct, but at the same time, talking to the locals, finding a way into the local kindergarten is probably just as valid. Do you know what I mean? Like every single angle we can come at. And it's whatever someone's values are, it's whatever their thinking is. And also remember that everyone's connected by degrees of separation. So even an arsehole capitalist is going to have a daughter or a cousin or a niece or a nephew. And Moss Cass gave a really powerful speech when I was in my 20s that went, the reason we had Labor passed the first set of environmental law federally was that the Minister of Defence's daughter, for want of a better word, was a hippie. Right? So he didn't personally believe in it, but his daughter believed in it. And she went up and said, Dad, you're going to vote with this block. And there was one vote, and that's how we got the environmental law. So it's as broad as we can get our message, and as consistently from every angle and using every value. And
I accept what you're saying. It's with a caveat that in BZE we tend to stick within our little areas of comfort. I like talking to Rotary clubs, and somebody else likes talking to U3As, and somebody else likes talking to schools, and somebody else. We've now got Stephen hammering on the doors of some politicians and the like, as far as I'm aware, and so starting to talk to some of the people that we ought to have been talking to much more seriously 2 years ago, 3 years ago, however long ago. And it's vital that we keep up this attack on all those fronts. If we simply go to let's do it from the grassroots and the community bit and bank on the fact that somebody's got a door.
Yeah, but I think, no, but I said that it leaks as well. Like, you said that and I was taking you. And for instance, one of my forest campaign friends 5 years ago, guess who she started making friends with? It's Matthew, what's the opposition? Who's going to be the next opposition leader? Right. Yeah, and who does she now go swimming with? In the swimming club, right? And so she's got his ear. Do you know what I mean? It's like that forward thinking.
I think you're agreeing with one another, but I think your point is really that there's more, perhaps there's been some more work done on the other stuff you're talking about, and we need some more work in that space that you're talking about. We need that to be emphasised a bit more.
Yeah, definitely.
Could I
Yes, just...
I really don't believe in this, trying to appeal to elites. I don't think it works. I only know one example where appealing to shareholders actually worked, and that is during the thalidomide thing with the shareholders and distillers had enough of seeing mangled babies and did something about the policy. But that's one example out of so many. Union Carbide is not an example, for instance. And there are you can find one example out of thousands of non-examples. And I've got a friend who's a friend of Lucy Turnbull, but I mean that's not going to swing it. We actually do need a revolution, or the threat of a serious threat of a revolution, and that means taking hold of really using the media, partly, or making our own media. There's something this big. I mean, I think Naomi Klein has really put a shot in the arm of the environmental movement and given us something to really think about. I think we really need the threat of something really serious happening, and that takes grassroots. So it doesn't need organising, it doesn't need, I know it sounds corny, building the movement. That's what it actually needs to change things, not appealing to elites.
Okay. Philip, appealing to the elites is not going to do the job.
Mike Collin.
I think you have to do grassroots and allied work. I don't think you can do one or the other. So, for example, if you just do grassroots, then what happens is the elites think. So, what happens if we only did what you suggested? And I mean, it's a big job to do. I'm not saying we shouldn't try to get a grassroots.
You can't do the grassroots work if you are appealing. If your policy is to appeal to the elites, you cannot.
No, but a movement can appeal to many different people at one time because different people are doing different things. So a movement could do both. But
even within one organisation, you can task different people to do different jobs, And you were saying there's not enough of people in BZE focused in that direction, in your opinion.
So people who brought us to this situation have been the people who are guilty are the people who brought us to this situation who have manipulated the media themselves. We're not appealing to.
So you don't think it's possible to change them? That's basically what you're saying.
It's not possible. By the evidence of the past, it's not possible.
Okay. On the contrary, sir. I think if you want to use a historical example, there was a long time when a number of leading business people argued very strongly that the economy was going to collapse if you did away with the slave trade. It wasn't too long before, in fact, they did do away with the slave trade, and I don't think you'll find anybody today who's going to argue in favour of it. And I think the same is going to go here. We'll get to the stage where there's got to be enough body of movement going, supporting the science and supporting the future of their own economies and their own futures and their own hip pocket.
Okay, we've got two questions. Richard, have you got a comment on those?
I'll do a comment on that one.
Okay.
If you look at the entire economy systemically, the problem that we've got is the limited liability component of corporation law that's listed on the stock exchange. If the people putting the money in were liable for more than the money that they put in, if they could lose more than the money they put in and actually be up for the consequences of whatever the corporation did with their money, such as investing in asbestos or investing in Bhopal or whatever, and actually having to pay out the communities for losing their forest lands or the mesothelioma, then we would stop. Most of the sick behaviour around the world, with a very simple change, it would reduce the amount of stress on everyone. It wouldn't require everyone with the same head to be constantly barraging against the social council or something else.
Okay. I mean, this is partly what you're saying, isn't it? Is in a sense, it's say to get the kind of transition happening, and to get, in a sense, maybe not that exact policy reform or that kind of reform happening, but it's similar, then we need to appeal to some elites who you might be able to get on the side.
Essentially, ICCC put pressure on.
Is that what you're saying, Philip?
I think we have to do a sort of an all of the above. I think that we've got to have grassroots involvement because the reason why Tony had one office was because he and the Conservatives, with the help of Murdoch, were able to project this idea that they were running. Remember him talking about the People's Revolution against climate change, like, you know, sort of to get rid of all this stuff. They became the Democrats, and the reason why they were able to run that particularly weird line was because the work that was being done on climate change was done by the Labor Party with people like Ross Garnaut, which was being done through elite circles. And they didn't spend enough time connecting with people in general in the community and you know, discussing why climate change is a problem and why these actions are actually good actions, or you know, word, etc. So they actually, the Labor Party actually in a sense advocated the community space, the grassroots space, which enabled Murdoch and the fossil fuel industry to pass themselves off as Democrats and say we look after our cost of living problems and it's all this climate change stuff is wrecking our lives. Now, so that's what happens if you don't do grassroots. If you're not engaging with grassroots, you just get, you know, you get outmaneuvered democratically. You lose elections and all sorts of things. If, on the other hand, all we do is have grassroots only, then that's extremely easy to pass off by people like the Murdoch Press and Tony Abbott as a bunch of you know, crazies who are you know, sort of envious of anybody who's got anything, and they see it as a threat to the system. So what happens is the fossil fuel industry and all the rest of the industry and all their, it's all bunched together to defend what they, you know, to defend their system. When in fact the fossil fuel industry is destroying everybody else's system, including the elites and, you know, the tourism industry, and everybody else is going to suffer because of what they're doing. So if we don't get involved in our elites, we'll end up with them working together all the time. But in fact, they can be split. And if they're split, you win.
Yeah, so we never won the forest movement in Australia because we've never been able to split the plantation movement and all the agroforestry movement from the native forest lodging movement. Most companies are dual plantation and dual plantation and native forest interests at the same time. So if we could, in New Zealand they split them and they won. They knocked out the native forest industry really quickly, stopped it at the scale.
Decades ago.
Yeah, decades ago. We've never split them and we've never won.
Okay, we're going to move on from elites. I'm sure we'll have to come back to them at some point in time in our campaign. But Richard,
just before I don't think
We're going to go a few minutes later.
sorry, what's that?
The point here was very well made and very interesting, and about changing laws.
Yeah.
Not really about
But you've got to have the power to change the law. You've got to have the power to change the
law
law.
is getting the people who actually can get enough, can get Obama on side, can get China on side, can get the large country leaders on side to say, no, this is a really dysfunctional economy. Let's change this very small amount. Let's not stopping the money flow. Just changing the conditions under which money flows. The report. They're saying it's absolutely dire. Forget them and Obama and China. To say, let's rewrite these two little lines of legalese that say people can sue the pants off the people they put their money into. They're not giving them absolute maximum profit.
What will that do to the entire block of the Nazis who control it?
I think we can have this. We've got 5 minutes left, and there's still a couple of people on the questions. It's a really good point, and it needs further discussion. And we're not saying it's not a good idea what you're saying. I think that probably the debate is more about how do you get that kind of legislation in place, and I think
the largest people who are currently very concerned to get that being there.
and we might classify them as the elites. So some of this might come down to the language we're using. People who are in power.
They're not the people who are currently investing, they're the people who are currently trying to get to leave a legacy.
Sure.
They're political groups.
Richard.
Back under the frame of industrial mobilisation, there is already a mechanism within the military in place for mobilisation. I used to be in the military, and I know Adrian used to be as well. There used to be a course, probably still is, a course within the military called the Industrial Mobilisation Course, the IMC. And it engages the military with industry, and they pull people out of industry to run this course to familiarise with the military. My point is, there may be some scope for us to try and co-opt that pre-existing mechanism to work in our favour, and try and learn what gears are in place for mobilisation and see how they can work for us.
I think it'd be a great idea. It'd be good to talk to some of the people involved in actually running the course and sort of see what kind of cooperation can be developed there. I mean, I don't think what we're talking about would sort of involve any kind of security risks. So it's like it's a discussion I think that could be had, sort of in an open way.
I mean, this is a question too in terms of skill set as well, isn't it? Like if BZE or another group was to take on a type of project that you're talking about in terms of a full package implementation report, then the question I guess for BZE is, does it have the skill set in place at the moment? What kind of skill set are we looking for to be able to produce a report like that or a piece of work like that? Where do we go to seek the kind of information that may be useful that exists, or what's the skill set here? What are we talking about? Economists, policy people?
I mean, it's industry policy. I mean, there's traditional economics, but a lot of traditional economists are so used to the system as it runs now, they don't know how to do the beyond business as usual methodology. So, presumably, I'm guessing the people who do the work on the industrial mobilisation course would probably know some people, at least, in the economics profession who kind of, like, for example, there's a whole bunch of stuff. This is the Buckland and whatever is history of Australia's involvement in the Second World War. Now, presumably people keep this stuff up to date a bit.
Yeah. Try and get yourself on that course.
Well, I have been trying to get connections and I haven't had any so far, so I should talk to you. Yeah.
I think that what Philip said earlier, what motivated the people was fear. And then what we have to do is spread fear, short of panic, across everybody. It has to reach into the boardrooms. Every bad weather event has to be attributed to this was climate change. I wonder what's going to happen to us next. And it should be on Facebook pages and Twitter and newspaper reporters. You'd like to see it in the newspaper that the Bureau of Meteorology evidently doesn't like to attribute this isolated weather thing to, what happens to climate change. They're not going to do it. Someone has to. Or the public will not have the fear to drive the change, which could happen exponentially from the ground up, although we do need to, But it's got to get into the boardrooms.
And that's going to happen. So at some point, when we keep saying
there's no fear yet in enough people.
Yeah, I mean, agreed. I grow my plants at home, right? So today was a terrible day for me because my plants are suffering. I come in here and Luke says, "Oh, not that many people here tonight. It's such a beautiful day outside." And I said, "It's a fucking death killer day. This is climate change, future nasty day, right?" And for him, Luke, it's still a lovely day. But I'm a plant grower, so I fear these days. I fear them, right? And so that we haven't even amongst ourselves understand what today's weather is, right?
So it has to be spread somehow.
Yes, and we've got to do that. And here's my zombie apocalypse meme from today, which is...
I like that. I really like it. I saw it before.
Yeah, it says so this is the famous Walking Dead series, which is like very popular at the moment. That's the main guy. He's looking at us very sternly, and he's saying, "Get prepping now. You've just elected another government who will not save you from a climate catastrophe." All right, and there's zombies all up against the fence. Now that might appeal to you guys, but for zombie people, I'm linking zombies to climate for zombie people. And that's, so
go to every demographic.
Yeah, you go to every demographic. And it's like Dino. Did anyone see Dino's speech in Brunswick? Dino played the planet candidate. His main point was there are 8 foods that get wiped out first, and coffee is one of them. So he talked about saving the hipster generation. And so we got to say chocolate. Yeah, chocolate. It's like we've got to put those into memes. I'm just waiting for get the hipster and save this hipster.
Rod Fontock's about to launch a campaign called The Last Tim Tam.
Have we got, there's obviously groups out there like the Climate Council,
I feel that I think
question. I guess it's question. I mean, in terms of, have we got the science to be able to create the level of fear that this lady's talking about, short of panic at the moment? Are there other projects or packages of work that it is a dollar priority, so I didn't realise it was going to be.
If anybody wants to take one of these, sorry, on the science, on the fear question, two things. One, I'm in the process of starting up a project to use the BZE methodology for doing things, to produce a report, do a sort of a stationary report around the safe climate science, to pick up on the safety methodologies and what we need to do and whatever. If anybody would like to help with that, if they know anybody else who might be interested, I've got a little leaflet to hand out, so we really need to do that. It's vital. We have to be able to we have to connect people with the real implications of what's going on. So I agree with your point about needing to get people to understand the reason for fear and facing it. I just add to that though, during the Second World War, once again, they had the fear. They had fear in abundance. What they also had to do was they had to create positive motivation. So if you look at the speeches of Churchill and Roosevelt and anybody else, pretty much, I mean, some other people who are less want to quote, but anyway, what they would often do is they'd say, we are facing, subliminally they'd say, we're facing the risk of death and losing our country and freedom and all the rest of it. And then they would put this positive. And so during the Second World War, they actually started kind of creating this notion of, we're doing this to create democracy, a better world, whatever. And so after the war, there was this quite a big surge of idealism because people sort of thought we've gone through all this terrible stuff, for what reason? So they actually, people like to have both. They need the fear, but they also need the positive thing. What we do in our happy, smiley society is we won't face fear, and we want to constantly talk about the positive, which then means that curmudgeons like us say, oh no, you've got to face fear, and people misunderstand and think that all we want to say is, you've got to go into the fear. You need both. You need both. You have to have a positive reason for why you want to create a better world and what that might look like. But we do, I totally agree, we need to face the reality of what is happening. Otherwise people just won't get out of business as usual, not only in society at large, but not in their own lives personally as well.
I've noticed that so many scientists talking about climate change are actually very polite, too polite. We need a spokesperson who will ram it home.
And just on that, I remember Phil and David telling me a story about one of the lead climate scientists who talks very calmly and quietly about it all, shaking himself like a child in front of them when they're talking about climate change in private. But publicly, this person still today talks calmly and rationally and on human goals. So we need people to be honest.
Radio Eco Shop.
Radio Eco Shop.
Eco Shop. It's on 3CR, 6 a.m. on Sunday. It's shocked the socks off me, and I could never broadcast like that. But he interviews everyone on this line of thinking. He says we'll all be extinct by 2030.
Oh, and don't forget BZE radio.
Well, much more than poison there.
Well, it's a great shame to bring this conversation to a stop, but we could turn to the pub around the corner. Would you please thank Philip, Luke, and Adrian. These kind of events couldn't happen without BZE, and we've spoken a lot about some of BZE's publications and the importance of them, and BZE only survives on donations from individuals. It doesn't get any funding from business or government, so if you're able to support BZE financially, that would be a great help. As I said, we're going to adjourn to the pub next door. If you'd like to further the discussion, there are some 3CR community radio raffle tickets to support BZE radio shows on sale just outside the door. Prizes include bicycles, 2 nights accommodation at Hepburn Springs Chalet, a barbecue, a double pass to Mona Former Festival plus more. Tickets are $2 each or 3 for $5, and as I said, they're outside the door.
This is a gas barbecue.
We also have a few CDs that have recorded on some of these discussion groups and the introduction to the launch of land use plan outside on the table for a gold coin donation. And thanks everyone for your support of this event throughout the year. 2014 has seen a range of topics covered from political strategy to electricity markets and from solar power modelling to heat pumps. You can catch up on YouTube recordings and download slides at the BZE website. And we're taking a break until the next discussion group, which will be the 2nd of February next year. Thank you very much.
And just one couple more plugs, if that's all right. So we're getting a group of groups together who are campaigning on the Climate Emergency Safe Climate Message, and we're meeting this Thursday at SLF. And basically, it's rather than we're going to lift the agenda so people who are actually campaigning, actually framing their communication in that space can work together and work together more effectively, rather than having to drop down to this non-climate emergency communication, which so much of the movement does. And the second one is Save the Planet. We didn't register for Victoria. We submitted 740 members and only got 285 returns. So if you can tick a box and return a piece of paper that's sent to you, please think about joining up and supporting us for the federal election, because the average first-term federal election government, as Kim Carr said this morning, is one year and 9 months. So we could